Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Daniel Davis Deep Dive Intel Brief, where we give you the information that you missed maybe this week. You didn't get a chance to watch everything, but want to make sure that you get the most important things that happened during the week so that you are prepared to enter next week. Listen, welcome. Happy Saturday morning to you guys all. We always appreciate you giving part of your weekend to us, and we want to make sure it's something and your time is well spent and valuable. So first of all, let's just jump in. I wanted to hit the most important thing first, which came later in the week. This past Thursday, President Putin of Russia made it wasn't so much an announcement as it was an interview with I think it was a local television reporter, but I assure you it was absolutely choreographed because the message he sent was as sober and profound as anything that's come out of the Kremlin since this war began. Putin, in the clip you're about to see here, is addressing the reports that the United States and the UK are on the verge of approving the use of their long-range weapon systems for use deep into Russian territory. Watch what he said.
Это решение будет принято. Это будет означать не что иное, как прямое участие стран НАТО, Соединенных Штатов, европейских стран в войне на Украине. Это их прямое участие. И это уже, конечно, существенным образом меняет саму суть, саму природу конфликта. Это будет означать, что страны НАТО, США, европейские страны воюют с Россией. А если это так, то, имея в виду изменение самой сути этого конфликта, мы будем принимать соответствующие решения, исходя из тех угроз, которые нам будут создавать.
Now, we're not completely sure what's going to come out of it, but on Friday, Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the UK, and Joe Biden were meeting on this very subject. And they're trying to decide, or at least come to some conclusion, whether they would do it. So that's why it was no mistake that Putin made that comment on Thursday heading into that meeting. Now, it remains to be seen just exactly what the U.S. and Ukraine, the UK are going to do about this. But I cannot more strongly explain. This is the most serious moment of this war that we have faced so far. We have crossed every so-called red line that you could imagine, everything that it's been worried about. And ironically, most of these red lines were self-imposed or self-described by, should we send offensive weapons? First of all, early in the war, should we send tanks? Should we send air defense capabilities, some of our top stuff? Should we send multiple launch rocket systems? Should we send F-16 aircraft? All those things we talked about. And all those things were theorized could be red lines, but it was never stated as such by Russia. They warned that there could be consequences if it's used, but they never specified what it was. This is the first time he was very, very specific. If you use these weapons, and he went on to say in that much longer clip there that he regards it as a direct intervention by the West against Russia, because it says you can't fire these kinds of sophisticated long-range weapons without satellite support, without intelligence support, and without a lot of technical operators. And he said Ukraine has none of those things. So it will mean by default, if they're used on Russian territory, it will only be because the United States or UK are personally using them against Russia. Now, it doesn't make any difference whether it's true or not. Most likely it is, but it doesn't matter whether it's completely accurate or not. It only matters the belief of the Russian side, because he said we will regard that basically as you being in a state of war with us. And he specifically used that term. And as I've mentioned before, the terms actually matter to Putin. When he says a special military operation, it's not just kind of an eye-rolling sort of, wordsmithing kind of thing to make it sound, less bad for the Russian people, almost like what we did with the well, actually, in some ways, it was similar to what the United States did in Korea when our president first called it a police action as opposed to a war, because by calling it a police action, that meant it didn't trigger the requirements in the Constitution to get an approval from Congress first. The president could just send some troops there for that. In similar way here, the special military operation has certain legal constraints, both constraints and opportunities within the Russian system to be able to conduct this at the scale that it's at. If he changes this to war, then it opens up new capacities and new opportunities for Russia to do things, to include much larger mobilization, the forced change in industrial capacity, for example, that they can now direct others to join in with what's already going on with their already very large military industrial sector. So it could just be a whole range of things. But the most important one, of course, is the potential for use of nuclear weapons. Sergei Lavrov also came out, I think, the day or so before this and expressly said and reminded people that, again, what you said barely a week or two ago, that they're renewing or updating their nuclear doctrine. They're adjusting it without being specific of what it is. But when he says it in context with this one here, then it's very clear that it could mean the escalation is on the table for nuclear use in the region. And listen, we had CIA Director Burns also, I think earlier last week, or maybe it was the previous weekend, where they said that Russia had been close to using nuclear weapons in the fall of 2022. We've reported that here before, based on actually a book by Jim Schiedel from CNN earlier this year. We talked about that, but now here's the CIA director confirming that was the case, that Russia was close to using when they felt that they were losing some territory within Ukraine, and they were considering doing it even then. Now imagine if actually the United States or NATO countries actually use long-range weapons into Russia, and especially if they hit any kind of sensitive targets. That the chance that Russia would say, okay, not only have you authorized a physical incursion of our territory, but now that you're allowing them to fire, really important weapons and capable weapons deep into our territory, they may then say, we have no alternative here. We're going to have to use force in return. And that could all too easily go nuclear. And it's literally just playing with fire. And Russia sent another message actually also on Friday morning, when they at least they announced the expulsion of 6 British diplomats. Actually, the expulsion itself took place a few weeks back, but they chose to publicly announce it, that their diplomatic credentials had been revoked this morning on Friday morning, on the eve of the Biden-Starmer meeting. And believe me, that is definitely intended to send a signal that Russia is serious about this. So it's important to talk about, like I said, in previous iterations, the red lines were presumed on our side, or we even stated on our side that it was a red line. They didn't. Now they are. Now they're saying, if this happens, we consider you in a state of war, and we will take appropriate countermeasures. And listen, to all those who say he's just bluffing, he was bluffing before, he'll be bluffing again. He's been bluffing a lot of times. Was he bluffing in October or February of 2022? I had written, by the way, in the months leading up to that, many people, I mean, the majority of those in the West were saying it's just posturing. He's just trying to put pressure on the West, trying to put pressure on Kiev to do some stuff and whatever, to go with the Minsk Accords. And I said, look, I'm looking at their force structure. I'm looking at what kind of equipment that they have, what kind of troops they have, the medical stuff, the reinforcements, the supply vehicles, all the things that I know that you need to actually conduct war were all present around there. So I said, no, they are serious. This is something that they may actually do and have the capability to do. So sure enough, they did. Well, in a similar way, right now, Russia has been spending really the better part of the last year and a half, maybe even longer, in preparing for a much larger engagement. And you have seen them. They've gotten new weapons contracts from Iran, now including both drones and missiles, certainly from North Korea, large numbers of in the millions of artillery shells of various calibers, thousands of vehicles and shipping containers full of unknown kind of other equipment. We don't even know for sure what they're getting, but we know they're getting a lot of it. And of course, their own industrial capacity. They've also been training lots and lots of men outside of contact. They've been positioning large groups of combat forces, to even include the Belarusian forces, in the proximity of the Ukraine frontier. And all the pieces are in place to where both conventionally or nuclear, and they've continued to do large-scale nuclear forces. right now, as we speak, Russia is engaging in the largest naval exercise that they have done since the end of the Cold War. So in at least 3 decades, they've never done one this big. There are 400 vessels, along with China, operating the Sea of Japan as we speak. So there are a lot of pieces in place. And by the way, a lot of those ships, of course, have nuclear weapons. So that's when you look at a map, that's not too far time of flight wise from some American targets. And we need to be very, very clear-eyed on this. Listen, I don't know what's going on in those meetings with Starmer and Biden, but I'm telling you, if I was in there, I would say this needs to be a hard no. A hard no. Do not give long-range weapons for 2 major reasons. One, we'll look at the Ukraine side. It's not going to change the war. Nothing is going to change the war. Having a relatively small number of these long-range missiles, because I promise you, we are not just going to give our inventory over to Ukraine. And by the way, by all reports, our inventories aren't that big already of these key long-range weapon systems. So we'll give them a small number. So even if every single one of them evaded Russian air defenses and hit their target, it's going to make the bear mad. It's like poking the bear in the chest, hitting the beehive, whatever allegory you want to use. It's going to make them mad, but it's not going to change the war. It'll hurt, but they have such a vast country and so many capabilities out there and so many different weapons depots, armed depots, factories, etc., that they have a redundancy all over the place. They've designed their system that way. So it won't do it. It won't have any effect on the war. The war will continue to go against the Ukraine side. But the second and far more important issue, it could spawn a nuclear retaliation. It could actually be the casus belli that Russia finally uses to say, we're at war now. And then all of a sudden, now then the conflict has been expanded. But don't do it, because it makes no sense. It doesn't help our allies. It doesn't help us. There is no possibility, zero, for us to come out on top by doing this. And if there is no possible path that where you can say this benefits Ukraine and it benefits the United States / NATO, it's got to be off the table. It's got to be a no. Don't care what anybody says. I don't care how it's spun as, oh, you're just showing weakness, because you can be sure that would come if they say no. There'll be no shortage of people howling that, oh, you're self-deterred. I can see the headlines right now, and some of these people that don't care. Shut up. I will say to them, because your mouth is running like this, and there's a lit fuse over here that needs to be put out. And if they listen to you, that fuse will keep going until it blows up in our face. We don't need that to happen. So that's the most important thing. I wanted to lead off the top with that one. Then we're going to go back to last Tuesday, where the long and hotly anticipated debate between President Trump and Kamala Harris first came up. The last time we saw Kamala Harris on a debate stage was in late 2019 of the 2020 election cycle, where she was eviscerated by her opponents there, especially Tulsi Gabbard. And so the question is going to be, how was she fare against Donald Trump, who's really experienced and usually does well at these kinds of things? Yeah, well, not so well. Didn't go so well for Trump. But one of the things that did stand out, and one of the things that Harris said with a lot of confidence, raised lots of eyebrows, to include mine at the time. Watch this.
And as of today, there is not one member of the United States military who is in active duty in a combat zone in any war zone around the world, the first time this century.
What is she talking about? This is just one place here. I mean, you see, this is the Middle East, and so there's troops all over the place, and there's U.S. troops all around the Russia-Ukraine war. That if things go south, they'll find themselves in combat pretty quickly, as we just mentioned here. But those folks that I just showed you right there, they're on the front lines. They are getting attacked. I mean, we had just a couple of days ago, or a week or so ago, 7 troops were wounded in action when they were going after ISIS militants. You know, allegedly, the reason why we claim we're even there in the first place is the, quote, enduring defeat of ISIS, which is completely unrealistic. There is no militarily attainable objective. There's just a bumper sticker, something to keep the troops there. And they keep doing missions like this ever so often to keep the headlines on, to make people think, oh, yeah, it really matters. And it doesn't. It doesn't matter at all. And but then we also had in that, Gary, if you can put that map back up there for a second, you'll see there in the section where there's troops in Jordan, in between Syria and Iraq, Syria and the Saudi Arabia up there in Syria, Egypt, etc. Jordan, you see that 3,500. We had 3 of our troops killed earlier this year in one of these Iran-backed militia groups in retaliation for some stuff that Israel was doing in the Gaza Strip. So we had troops killed. We had Mike Domino on, a former CIA counterterrorism officer, who said that, look, there's been over 200 attacks against the United States forces in that area, all spread out there since the October 7th of last year, since Israel was attacked by Hamas. 200 attacks. And you want to tell everybody that no American forces are in harm's way, are in a wartime situation? I mean, what does she think those are? What about the American pilots that were actually engaged in combat operations against Iranian drone and missile attack a few months back in April, I think it was? What about the U.S. fleet that's sitting in the Red Sea, the Mediterranean, and elsewhere that are constantly fighting against the Houthis and going up against missiles that are fired against them even? What does she count all that stuff? And I just, for the life of me, don't understand why you would want to make such a clearly and obviously demonstrable statement. What is there to brag about to the American people that no one's in harm's way when there are thousands of Americans in harm's way? Many have been wounded. Some have been killed. I'm just telling you, as someone who was deployed in that area in combat zone, I find it insulting that you consider apparently so little our contribution and the risk that you're asking us to take as the government that currently is in power, that you don't even consider that dangerous. I just don't understand why she would do that, and at the same time trying to say how much of a supporter they are of the troops. It just seems to work at counter purposes. And then, of course, I'm arguing that we need to withdraw those troops because they do nothing for us. They don't do anything to improve the security of the United States. It just makes, I don't know, some people happy, and certainly in the Pentagon, it makes some people happy. Some people in the defense industry, it makes them happy. They just cannot get their fingers and let anything go. As you saw, they're still 3 years later crying about the loss of the deployment in Afghanistan, and they're clinging with white-knuckled tenacity to the troops in Iraq and in Syria and anywhere else over there. They don't want any of them to go, even though there's no compelling American security interests that would keep them there. I digress. But sticking with the same concept on the Harris debate, we also had Kelly Vlahos, who is the editorial director at Responsible Statecraft magazine here in Washington, D.C. She was looking at some of the stuff that Harris had said regarding I just let her speak for herself. Watch this.
She keeps bringing this anecdote up that she was talking with Zelensky days before the invasion. Are we supposed to think you did a good job? Like, what are we supposed to draw from that? I think she just kind of wants to humble brag that she was in the mix and she actually was on the scene.
In the room when it happened.
And, right, talking with Zelensky. But at the same time, she's showing how ineffectual she and the administration was. They're like, hi, you're going to be invaded. Here's some tips. I mean, I think Trump actually caught her and called her out on that towards the end of the debate, where he said, you guys didn't do a very good job. If it was me, they wouldn't have invaded. So you go there and you visit and they invaded two days later. Like, what does that even mean?
Now look, let me say again, by all accounts, and including mine, in terms of debate performance, man, she just killed it. She just blew him out of the water. Trump was not prepared. He didn't have comebacks, to some obvious things that would have been easy to just shred the arguments that the vice president was making. He just didn't do it. He wasn't ready. And it looked like it. And of course, to an American public who's watching this, when they see her make these, strong declarative statements, and especially when they're delivered with, impassion and they sound confident, she's dressed, like a professional, she looks presidential, then they're liable to think, well, I guess it's right. That's one of the reasons we have this show here and why we're showing this particular clip here, because there's a lot wrong with what she said and what Trump could have easily just deflected what she said. But one of the key things is she was bragging in that section there that she had gone to Zelensky. And what she actually said was, I talked to him before it came in and gave him some pointers about how he can defend himself. And I'm thinking, okay, wait a minute. What are you talking about? You told him how to defend himself? Are we supposed to expect that you're some kind of a military strategist, that you can actually tell him how to defend himself? And by the way, that's not what happened. The government did not tell him to defend himself. What the government told him was, here's a plane. You can flee over to the western part of your country where all of our embassy staff just left. That hey, we're telling everybody to leave the country. We think that you could fall within 3 days. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the guy who is supposed to actually give military advice, said he thinks the capital city could fall in 3 days. That was on the 5th of February, 2022. So about 2 weeks before the war started. That's what the administration was saying. And by all public accounts, even what they told them at the time was, they're coming. You better take this seriously, not giving them advice. And then let's back up a little bit further too. Why were we only talking to Zelensky? Why did we not have diplomacy to talk to Vladimir Putin? Why did we not try to say, hey, let's work something out here? What can we do? What kind of negotiations can we have here? What would be needed to just get to the minimum level to where you don't engage? Because according to what Biden himself said publicly before the fact, is that we have intelligence showing they're about ready to go. Now, of course, I'd mentioned before, I'd written on this and I saw the same things. I didn't even see classified information, but what I could see that was publicly out there showed that they were ready. So I agreed completely with that assessment. But that's when you should have been doubling down on diplomacy. See, that's one of the things that's so important. When you look at who you want to be the commander in chief, you want that person, man or woman, to be the one who's going to try to keep us out of any war, and will only use military force if it is absolutely necessary for our national security, to defend our country or our interests. That's it. It's not a policy tool. It's not something to coerce somebody to do something that we want, because that is an egregious, number one, violation of the Constitution and the 1973 War Powers Act. It's also a misuse of our military personnel to hold their lives so cheap that we're willing to use them as literal pawns on a strategic chessboard to try to accomplish some policy outcome that we want. So one should reasonably ask the current administration, why did you not put a lot more effort in diplomacy with Russia to try to walk them off the ledge, to try to give them any reason at all not to attack while still preserving our security? But instead, you see you're cocky there that, yeah, I told them how to defend themselves here. No effort was even made to go to Russia. And that's of course endemic right now. When was the last time that the president of the United States talked to his counterpart to Russia? Hasn't happened. Not since I think the last time was, at least in face-to-face, was certainly June of 2021. But there's no evidence that he's even made a phone call since the war broke out. No effort at all at diplomacy. All we want to do is, quote, give Ukraine as much as we can for as long as it takes. And of course, now then, as I'm speaking here, they're probably still talking, certainly we're on Friday, about expanding the war yet another time with the introduction of long-range weapons. By American troops would then obviously have to use these, as would British troops, because Putin is correct. Those things cannot just be, it's not like a rifle that can just hand it to Ukraine and, go off and take care of this and do whatever you want to do with it. This is something that has to be handled, targeted, and operated by highly technical and competent combat troops. That's just the way it is. It's the way the system's designed. Those things can't just, you can't hand them off to somebody and just shoot them. So if that happens, we will be in a real problem. And I want to hear someone who wants to be the commander in chief explain how they're going to do something to use diplomacy to solve the problem at the lowest possible level, at the lowest possible cost. That's supposed to be, that shouldn't even be a question. That should be an assumption that anyone who wants this office wants to solve problems at the lowest level, at the lowest cost. Not to ignore a whole category of anything that doesn't include military and see how high we can ramp it before getting sucked into a war. I mean, how ridiculous is that? Yet that's the state of play in American electoral politics today about who wants to be the next president of the United States. And to his credit, although he did really kind of stumbled around, is Trump actually does want to have a negotiated settlement. He actually said that, and that's one of the areas where certainly we applaud him on that. He wasn't quite so Seguin in the Middle East, and it's unknown what he would do in Asia because that wasn't brought up for some reason. The debate moderators didn't think it was important enough to talk about, even though it's a potential area of another nuclear conflict. But we'll discuss that at a later date since they didn't. Moving on. Now let's go, in fact, to the Middle East. We had Professor Omar Bartov, professor at Brown University of Genocide and Holocaust Studies and a former IDF combat soldier. That's really important to point out here because he is trying to, he had just returned not long ago from a visit to Israel where he was born and raised and has been living in the United States for quite a long time. But he said he tries to go back at least once a year. And this was the first time he'd been since the October 7th terrorist attack against his country had started. And he said he was shocked by what he saw and disturbed. Watch this.
We now have a situation in Israel of 50-50. There are 7 million Palestinians and 7 million Jews in the area controlled by Israel. Of the Palestinians, 2 million Israeli citizens, who are in many ways second-class citizens, and the others are occupied population. And so that question, how do you resolve that, has been at the core of Israeli politics. And yet, in the last 2 decades, under Netanyahu, he has argued consistently that we can manage this issue. Somehow, we don't need to talk about the occupation. In fact, it's not even called an occupation in Israel anymore. It's an area that belongs to historic Eretz Israel, the land of Israel. And on October 7th, that whole idea, that whole paradigm exploded in everyone's face because Hamas attacked viciously, brutally, killing hundreds of civilians, but showed that you cannot keep that group under the rug, that you have to resolve it. And now the question is, do you resolve it by military force, meaning expulsion, suppression, and ultimately genocide, or do you do it politically? And to do it politically, there's not enough force in Israel. There's not enough of a public in Israel today to push for that on its own. It can only happen with outside pressure, and the most important pressure has to come from the United States, from the American government.
One of the things that he said there elsewhere in that article, I'm sorry, in that episode, but also in an article he had written in The Guardian, was that there is not enough military power in the Israeli Defense Forces to militarily solve all of their problems that they're trying to do. You have Netanyahu, the prime minister of Israel, who emphatically says he is going to have, quote, complete victory. He wants to utterly destroy, not defeat, but destroy Hamas, which means wipe them off the face of the earth, which means none left. He wants to kill or jail all of them, and that is his objective. That is militarily unattainable. The only way that can be attained, the only way that it can actually be attained is to expel or kill all of the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. That's it. There's no other way. And now then you add on top of that this constant friction between Israel and Hezbollah in the north of their country, in the southern part of Lebanon, that also cannot be solved militarily. And especially after the Israeli Defense Forces have spent now almost closing in on a year since this attack first happened. And they are worn out. And they have used their reserves almost like, not almost, but like basically like an active duty force. But that is having catastrophic impact on the society within Israel. It's causing a terrible impact on their economy. Of course, they're losing millions and millions of dollars to tourism that they normally rely on because a lot of people are afraid to go there. So that it's like way, way down. The economy itself, because the people who are supposed to run the economy are in uniform in large segments of time. So they're having problems with that too. They have hundreds of thousands of people that have been pushed out of the northern part of Israel because they can't safely stay there because of this constant back and forth of missile and rocket fire between Israel and the Hezbollah. So, and literally there's hundreds of thousands on both sides of that, by the way, that have been expelled. But all that's putting pressure on Netanyahu. And instead of saying, you know what, this is just a bridge too far, we're going to have a negotiated settlement. We have to have a ceasefire. The United States has been trying to get a ceasefire for months and months and months, even going so far as to the very rare exception place where they went to the United Nations, UN Security Council, to get a resolution passed that calls for an immediate ceasefire. And of course, there hasn't been one, because Netanyahu doesn't want a ceasefire. What he wants is unmitigated and unrestricted military support from the United States. And if he has his way, and this is based on an observation of actions, not words, because with his actions, Netanyahu wants to draw the United States into a war with Iran and with Hezbollah, because with the entire United States armed forces, he's actually got a shot. If, all things being considered, and taking the morality out of it, and the consequences that may happen, and what if Russia joins in with Iran, et cetera, those are separate issues that are related. But for the moment, it would be, let's be plausible from his perspective, that if he can draw the United States and basically just take the U.S. armed forces to use as his own to do what he wants in the region, it's plausible. Short of that, it's not. So that means it's incumbent on the American president to say it is not in our interest at all, zero, to get into a war in the Middle East. We are not, the U.S. armed forces are not for the Israeli defense forces, for the Israeli prime minister to use as his extension of his own forces. That's not what they're for. They're for our defense. They're to defend the United States against any attempt to attack us, so that our borders are defended and our interests around the world are defended, and that we have the ability to make good on our alliances systems that we have in various parts of the world. That's what our armed forces are for, not for use by Netanyahu. And so Professor Bartov very correctly said, the only way that this comes to an end is if the United States finally uses its leverage with the military support, with the ammunition, et cetera, and its diplomatic influence, and says, here and no further. If you want to continue on your war, you will do it on your own. You're a sovereign nation. You can do what you want, but you will do it without our help, because we're not going to go any further than this. That's what the president should do. That's what, in an isolation, would have been great to hear from the candidates on this topic at the debate, so that we would know before we vote who we're going to get into office, because that's what's in America's interest. If you're wanting to find out who the next commander-in-chief is going to be that you want to hire the person that's going to take care of your interest, the person that's going to look first to defend our country, to preserve our combat power, to not fritter away the lives of our service members. That's what you should happen. Now, I'm not naive. I understand that this is an election, so no one wants to talk about that because of all the Israeli money that's in American politics and how toxic it is to even say anything against the Israeli government, as though that's somehow synonymous with Jews, even though there are, ironically, millions of Jews who are saying the same things I'm saying right now, Bartov being one of them. So it's irrational, but it's also unrealistic to think that that's what's going to happen, even though it should, because what we so desperately need is somebody who's not just worried about getting elected, and that goes equally for Trump or Harris, but somebody who's emphatically worried about being good for the United States and taking care of us, and will stand up and say, I will show the leadership, because that's what we want in our commander-in-chief. I'm going to show you the leadership that I'm going to do the right, hard thing, no matter the cost, because that's what we expect. And we don't have any of that right now. And we just have to live with that. That's just the way it is right now. But you know the truth. This could be over, as Bartov said, and I agree, within a couple of weeks. If the president made that decision, that political decision, they would have military ramifications within 2 weeks. Israel would not be able to. They would be required, like countries throughout history, throughout thousands of years of human history, have come to a similar circumstances where ways and means don't line up, and you have to make the best decision you can with what's available at the time to get a war stopped and to bring back into some kind of equilibrium to where stability can be restored. That's what nations always do. There's nothing special about Israel in this case. It's happened many, many times before, and God willing, it'll happen many times into the future, as long as we don't cook ourselves with nuclear weapons. But again, that's a topic for another day. All right, moving on to the last one here. We had one of our favorites on, is Larry the Shirt Johnson. And he was talking about the Russia-Ukraine war, and really kind of getting down into the nitty-gritty of what this war is genuinely all about.
I'm here with President Zelensky. I am such a admirer of what you and your country have done. You're trying to stop the Russians so we don't have to fight them. They don't want any American troops. They just need the weapons to free their country of a terrible invasion. They're sitting on $1 trillion worth of minerals that could be good to our economy. So I want to keep helping our friends in Ukraine. We can win this. They need our help.
Yes, we need, and we have already, the biggest help is the support of American people and support of our friends, thanks to Lindsey and his colleagues, to congressmen and senators from the United States. Thanks for this support, bipartisan support. Thank you so much.
Peace is coming.
Yes, soon.
He finally spoke about what it's all about, the money. It's all about those resources. BlackRock wasn't investing in you putting all this money and investment into Ukraine, or it's not so much investment, is getting rights signed over to them just because the Ukrainians have a lot of beautiful women. You know, this wasn't about stocking a beauty pageant. This was about access to oil, access to gas. When you consider the fact that Ukraine, of all countries in the world, is the 5th largest in terms of natural resources. The natural resource countries come, I think Russia's number 1, United States is number 2, China may be like number 3. Forget who number 4 is. Ukraine's number 5.
Wow.
And so then you look back and go, so if they got all that wealth in terms of natural resources, why are they the poorest nation in Europe? And the reason is the corruption.
And I don't want to tag off on that last thing that he just said there, because that is far more important than may be apparent. Ukraine has, as Larry said, the 5th largest pool of natural resources of any country on the planet. By all rights, they should be at least in the top 10 most rich countries on the planet. And instead, they are the poorest country in all of Europe. Think about that for a second. What does that tell you? That tells you that the administration and the system of governance is intensely corrupt, because they have been subverting themselves from the beginning. So they undercut their own chances of success, and it's been happening for 30 years, ever since 1991, when they became an independent nation. So they have been harming themselves, and that means they've been stealing a lot of their own country's resources. The oligarchs, the people who were in power, and man, there's been a lot of different leaders that have been kicked out of office. They've had revolutions, all kinds of, in a relatively short period. All that instability is because of corruption. It's just exchanging one corrupt leader for the next one. And I know it's not popular to say in the United States today, especially because we think Zelensky is the next great hero in Western civilization. But here's the truth, that it's still all about the money, and it's still about corruption, because this is from December of 2023. This is after all of the ashes stopped falling from the attempted offensive by the Ukraine side in the 2023, from the summer up to December. So it was a disastrous. They lost tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of troops during that offensive. And here in December, you have this big happy picture with all these happy faces in it of people saying, yeah, we're going to keep giving weapons and stuff to Ukraine, even though that they have just failed. And by all rights at that time, we should have said, okay, we gave them every chance that we could. We gave them thousands of combat vehicles and millions of rounds of various types of ammunition, and they didn't even dent the Russian line. And now Russia's stronger than they were before. And now over time, now then that arc is just going to keep going higher. By all rational thoughts, we should have said, all right, now it's time to have a negotiated settlement. If we had done that, a lot of people would be alive who are no longer alive. They would have more territory, because following they continued to lose ground. But now then you see, that was the happy picture, the weirdly happy picture in December 2023, sorry. And then now then that one with Lindsey Graham was from earlier this month. And you see nothing has changed. It's still all about the money. You still see Graham openly bragging about trillions of dollars worth of natural resources. And he wants to get his grubby little fingers on it. Or he wants to get this pipeline from the U.S. of all these different capabilities. And so he wants to defeat the Russian armed forces so that he can then exploit them for the American side. I mean, it's not even hidden. That was kind of hidden. That was always true kind of in the shadows. Now he's just saying it out front. But here's the thing this time. It doesn't matter what you want. It doesn't matter what you want to accomplish or what you want to steal from somebody else, because right now it's not possible. Ukraine will never win this war. There is no path to military victory. There is no longer a path even to sustain what they have. They are now starting to lose in the north, in the Kursk area. That is finally starting to be whittled down piece by piece. Not only are they suffering casualties every day from the bombs, the glide bombs, the artillery pieces, the mortars, the direct fire. Now, all of a sudden, there are maneuver forces by Russia methodically cutting that thing into ribbons. And very soon it'll be unsustainable, and they'll have to either withdraw them all or lose them all. And meanwhile, in the east, they continue to lose area around Pokrovsk, and that continues to go down as well. And there is no reason why anyone should think anything different is going to happen. There's no magic weapons, this long-range weapons that won't change anything. There's no magic capability that's going to come. The Ukraine side isn't magically going to suddenly have combat experience just infused into their troops and they'll be able to fight differently. They're not going to. There's no path to it. They will eventually lose the war because of the policies that we're adopting, because of the path that we're going down. We are ensuring that the Ukraine side will lose, and then we will be face to face with a dilemma that I don't think anyone in the West has given any thought to, that we will come to a fork in a road. And unless things get out of hand with this long-range missile stuff first and that war explodes. If it doesn't, then conventionally, we'll eventually get to a point to where the Ukraine army can no longer maintain any of its fronts and it will physically collapse. And then the West will say, do we acknowledge that everything we have tried to do, all these grandiose statements and all these promises of support for as long as it takes, will have turned into, been exposed as being absurd? And then we just have to close off the chapter, shut that down, build up our defenses along the eastern flank in NATO, and go on with our lives, knowing that we lost and seeing that Russia is now much stronger than it was in February 2022? Or do we make matters worse and escalate the war and think about even entering into the war to save the western part of Ukraine, for example? It's hard for me to imagine us acknowledging failure and just, nipping it in the bud and just saying, all right, that's it. We did the best we could, because we should have done that in December of 2023. We didn't. And you see, we're not doing it now. So it seems unlikely we're going to do it then. And that is one of my biggest concerns, and why I keep talking about this kind of stuff and making sure that you know the truth and that we keep getting it out there. So again, I ask you to support this channel, like and subscribe. That has more impact than many people realize, and share this with everybody else. And we've actually added, our podcast capabilities now. You can get these podcasts nearly anywhere you get podcast, Apple iTunes podcast, iHeartRadio, Spotify, etc. All the things you can see there on the screen. Spread this around, folks, because the more people know the truth, the harder it is for folks like Lindsey Graham to say some of these absurd things it is. And we want to make it hard on the decision makers too, whether in the United States, UK, or any other country in the West. We want to support anyone who's moving towards peace. Thank you very much for watching. We always appreciate you, and we'll see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.